Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and we are now going over the next reading for part 2 of our book. The book is 4 Fundamental Questions, an Introduction to Philosophy, and this is question number 2 we've been going over, which is what is real? And we finished Leibniz in the previous video, so in this video we're going on to Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is just a one-page sample of his book, The Gay Science, and it is from book 4, which is entitled Sanctus Januarius, and that has a double meaning. It means Holy January, and it's referring to New Year's Day, which is the first reading we have, and it also refers to Saint Januarius, who was martyred on order of Emperor Diocletian around 300 AD, or CE, and he was saving Christians who were being persecuted at the time from being murdered, but then he was arrested and beheaded. But he's more famous for the miracle that supposedly happens to his blood 3 times a year, which is preserved in a glass vial, and it turns from a dried up, encrusted form to liquid form in front of the faithful 3 times a year. So Nietzsche plays with words, and he has double meanings for things. So this, we'll see his atheistic argument in the next little paragraph that we'll read. But it's important to keep in mind how fond he is of wearing masks. And his idea of nature is that it's an artist. The will to power is this underlying cosmic force, which is fundamentally a creator. In his first book and throughout subsequent books, he refers to this underlying force as Dionysus, referring to the Greek god, but Nietzsche gives it his own interpretation. So that's a nice little context for this, although it's not that important for our discussion questions. So I'll just go here to the first sample on page 205. He says, for the new year, so it's New Year's Day. He says, I still live, I still think. I must still live, for I must still think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. So that's a reference to René Descartes, who said, I know I exist because I think. Even if I doubt everything else, I'm still doubting. So I know that I'm thinking, and if I think, then I must exist. So cogito means I think, ergo sum, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. Nietzsche's referring to that, but he also says sum ergo cogito, I am, therefore I think. So he's saying, if you exist, you think. Your mind is incessantly moving. It's also important to understand Nietzsche was coming out of a kind of a depression at this time. So like Saint Januarius's blood, he was feeling this new liquefaction of his creative powers. And this is his advice for the new year. He says, today everyone takes the liberty of expressing his wish and his favorite thought. Well, I also mean to tell what I have wished for myself today and what thought first crossed my mind this year. A thought which ought to be the basis, the pledge, and the sweetening of all my future life. I want more and more to perceive the necessary characters in things as the beautiful. I shall thus be one of those who beautify things. Amor fati, let that henceforth be my love. I do not want to wage war with the ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not want even to accuse the accusers. Looking aside, let that be my sole negation, and all in all, to sum up, I wish to be at any time hereafter only a yea-sayer. So, love fate, amor fati. So, it's pretty straightforward. He wants to see things that are necessary, meaning things that happened. If they happened, well, there's nothing you can do about it. And if they must happen, like you must die eventually, there's nothing you can do about it. It's necessary. So he wants to see the necessary as the beautiful. And that way, he'll see everything as beautiful, and he'll beautify the world that way. But the very worst thing he'll do, rather than accuse something of being ugly, is he'll just look aside. He won't look at it. That's his advice on New Year's Day. after a long period of time where he felt how everything in life was oppressive and ugly. So he wants now to see everything that he formerly interpreted as ugly and mean as being beautiful. All right, so this next paragraph is aphorism number 285. And this is his atheistic, he's trying to express the pain of atheism, of renouncing belief in God, but also how that might be necessary to become a higher type of a human being. So I'll just read sections here. I might skip a line or two. He says, Excelsior, thou wilt nevermore pray, nevermore worship, nevermore repose in infinite trust. Thou refusest to stand still and dismiss thy thoughts before an ultimate wisdom, an ultimate virtue, an ultimate power. Thou hast no constant guardian and friend in thy seven solitudes. Thou livest without the outlook on a mountain that has snow on its head and fire in its heart. There is no longer any requiter for thee, nor any amender with his finishing touch. There is no longer any reason in that which happens, or any love in that which will happen to thee. There is no longer any resting place for thy weary heart, where it has only to find and no longer to seek. Thou art opposed to any kind of ultimate peace. Thou desirest the eternal recurrence of war and peace. Man of renunciation, wilt thou renounce in all these things? Who will give thee the strength to do so? No one yet has had this strength. So then he goes on to say, so that was a quote from, I don't know who it was from, but it was a quote. Now he's commenting on that quote. It was more, he was creating it as if he was quoting somebody. Then he says, there is a lake which one day refused to flow away, and threw up a dam at the place where it had hitherto discharged. Since then, this lake has always risen higher and higher. Perhaps the very renunciation will also furnish us with the strength with which the renunciation itself can be borne. Perhaps man will ever rise higher and higher from that point onward, when he no longer goes out into a God. So, not believing in God, he says no one has yet had this strength. Well, there had been plenty of atheists before Nietzsche, but he's claiming here that there wasn't. People claim to renounce God, but if you read the rest of Nietzsche's books, he'll say, if you believe in something, for example, like truth, you might say, oh, I'm an atheist because I believe in the truth, not in fictions. Well, Nietzsche would say, well, you still believe in truth. Isn't that some kind of an absolute transcendental principle? It's not a physical thing, therefore you too believe in a God, a spiritual, eternal, ordering principle. So he's saying no one's been a true atheist yet. But if somebody could be a true atheist and not believe in any kind of a divine sanctioning principle, and especially he's saying here, imagine that there is no God to help you through the hard times, to pick up your slack when you can't quite finish things. You can't repose yourself in infinite trust in the cosmos. There's nothing to protect you from the cosmic forces. So he's saying that his metaphor of the lake is like a lake that flows out into a stream. The human will flows out into God. So he's saying, well, if you blocked up that belief in God, then that will power would rise higher and higher and higher. No one's able, he's saying, to give up the belief in these kinds of divine principles. But if somebody could, maybe that renunciation itself, just the sheer will to stop believing in any kind of supernatural, transcendental principles, would give you the strength to endure that renunciation, and then, like a lake that's dammed up, you'd rise higher and higher. So the next paragraph on page 206, this is aphorism number 341. This is his idea of the eternal recurrence. The greatest burden is what he calls it. So what if a demon crept up after thee into thy loneliest loneliness some day or night, and said to thee, this life as thou livest it at present, and hast lived it, thou must live it once more. and also innumerable times, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and every sigh, and all the unspeakably small and great in thy life must come to thee again, and all in the same series and sequence, and similarly this spider and this moonlight among the trees, and similarly this moment and I myself. The eternal sand glass of existence will ever be turned once more, and thou with it, thou speck of dust. So he's saying, how would you react if somebody said that to you and you believed what they said? Would you gnash your teeth, or would you praise that person as a god? How must you be inclined towards yourself to actually want that to happen? And Nietzsche says in the middle of the paragraph, or hast thou once experienced a tremendous moment in which thou wouldst answer him, thou art a god, and never did I hear anything so divine. So for one tremendous moment of life, if you've ever experienced even one moment that was so great that if someone told you, oh yeah, you'll live that moment again and again forever into the infinite future, then I'll just continue reading here. He said, Dost thou want this once more, and also for innumerable times would lies the heaviest burden upon thy activity? Or how wouldst thou have to become favorably inclined to thyself and to life, so as to long for nothing more ardently than for this last eternal sanctioning and sealing? So it's it's a thought experiment to see how you actually think about yourself and your life. If the idea of the eternal return makes you fall on the ground and weep, then you must think your life has been pretty miserable. But if you rejoice at the idea, then you must have had at least one tremendous moment in your life that you think it would be worth living through everything else just so that you could experience it again and again. While reading that, I think it's important to note this was written in 1881, or published in 1881, and in 1905, Albert Einstein came out with his special theory of relativity, which says the past, the present, and future all coexist eternally. They don't come around and around in a cycle. They never fade to begin with, because space and time are interwoven. Just like space in front of you and behind you continue to exist, so does the future and the past, which are relative terms. What's in front of me could be behind you, and what's the future for me could be the past for you, depending on how fast you're moving, in what direction, and as I've gone over that before in other videos. But it's not such a thought experiment as it might seem at first. You could ask yourself, I've lived this life, which according to the Einstein's special theory of relativity, as opposed to the general theory, which includes the special theory, the past, the present, and future coexist. Everything I've ever done is eternally fixed like a block of ice, and everything that I will do is already done. How would that affect your mind? It would a similar kind of a thought experiment, but I think is less, just for pure fancy of thought as a practical question given the physics that shape our civilization today. All right, so to these discussion questions on page 207, number one, what would it mean to put the idea of amor fati into action? Explain. So you see everything that happens as beautiful. If it happens, it's beautiful. What would it mean to put that into action? So, in the United States of America, we're a very polarized nation. Politically, there's a left wing, there's a right wing. That's typical of human nature. So he would say everything. So if you vote for one side and your opponents win, you wouldn't say, oh, this is the worst thing ever, and weep and moan. You'd say, this is beautiful. Or at the very worst, you would look aside, not comment. If you were walking down the street and you saw a car swerve to miss a squirrel and then run into somebody on the sidewalk, maybe you'd look aside. You wouldn't want to look, but you wouldn't say, oh, how horrible. You wouldn't say anything is bad. You wouldn't negate anything. You would just accept everything as beautiful, and thereby you'd beautify the world. Well, does that leave any room for fighting against injustices. Nietzsche would seem to say, if you see some gross injustice happen, well, look aside if you can't bear it, or better yet, see it as necessary and beautiful. That's one way to interpret it. I think maybe in moderation, this kind of an idea would be helpful. There was a movie made about a similar concept by Jim Carrey called Yes Man, where he saw some motivational speaker who said, just say yes to everything. And so he started living life like that, and his life got better to some degree, but then in the end, his girlfriend thought, oh, you're just saying yes to everything because that's your general rule. It's not that you really want to be with me. And so at any rate, you can, if you've seen that movie, you kind of get the idea of what this question's asking. You know, what would it mean to see everything as beautiful? Okay, discussion question 2. How would you respond to the thought experiment in paragraph or aphorism 341? Why and explain. So that was the eternal recurrence. How would you respond? Would you like to hear that everything that you do will happen again and again? And here's also an important point that Nietzsche doesn't make explicitly clear. Is he saying here that you have free will to choose to do something, and when you do anything in this life, that'll be the first time, but whatever you choose to do will be repeated again and again? Or is he saying you're not choosing to do anything? Everything you've done innumerable times in the past, and you'll do it again and again in this big cycle of events in the future. Because if you're doing everything for the first time, which will then be repeated, that still leaves room for free will. But if you're just playing the same sequence one out of an infinite number of times, stretching to the infinite past and future, then there's no free will. And so that's two different ways to respond. Having read Nietzsche, it's more likely that he believes in the eternal return as opposed to the immortal or endless return. Implies it stretches into the infinite past. That would be more consistent with relativity theory. It would be more consistent with other philosophies like the Hindu philosophy with which Nietzsche was very familiar. But at any rate, as with all these discussion questions, there's no right or wrong answer as far as how would you respond or what's your opinion. What I'm really grading on is knowledge of the text. Your opinion is your opinion. Your knowledge of the text, however, I can gauge that. Did you read it? I can tell. Okay, so discussion question 3. Compare the idea that we make ourselves through our actions as it occurs here and in Sartre's lecture, Existentialism. So when he says the idea that we make ourselves through our actions, I'm assuming this is Richard Bilsker's, he's the one who wrote these discussion questions. I'm assuming he's referring to aphorism number 285, where he says, you know, if you don't believe in God, that's like damming up the stream that releases the lake, which will then rise higher and higher. So you make yourselves. There's no God who's going to help you make yourself. You have to take responsibility for who you are, and you create yourself. So compare the idea as it happens here as it is with Sartre. Well, for one thing, if you see this paragraph about not believing in God anymore, and then you look just that one below, which is much later in the book, where he talks about the eternal return would refute Sartre's idea of shaping the future. And if we make ourselves through our actions, as it occurs to Nietzsche, he says, okay, there's no God, you have to create yourself. But when he throws in that idea of the eternal return, it confuses everything. So, for example, Sartre on page 135, he talks about, let's just read here. So the second full paragraph, he says, the existentialist does not think that man is going to help himself by finding in the world some omen by which to orient himself, because he thinks that man will interpret the omen to suit himself. Therefore, he thinks that a man with no support and no aid, meaning no support from God, is condemned every moment to invent man. Somebody named Ponge, I don't know how to pronounce that, but I think it it is. Ponge, in a very fine article, has said, man is the future of man. That's exactly it. But if it is taken to mean that this future is recorded in heaven, that God sees it, then it is false, because it would really no longer be a future. If it is taken to mean that whatever a man may be, there is a future to be forged, a virgin future before him, then his remark is sound. But then we are forlorn. Forlorn because there's no God to help you in this horribly difficult life filled with obstacles that people pray to God for help to overcome. Well, there is no God, so you're forlorn. You're by yourself. So make of yourself what you will. So that big part of Sartre's philosophy is negated by Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return. So that complicates things. But on the other hand, if you combine what Nietzsche's saying, compare it to Sartre, Sartre's saying, oh, we're forlorn, anguished and despairing because of his atheistic worldview, whereas Nietzsche's saying, well, maybe giving up on God won't just lead to this kind of a forlorn life, but it will give you the strength to endure that sacrifice of a belief in some kind of an ultimate meaning and meaning giver in life. And here's another point just to keep in mind about Sartre. He emphasizes that since there is no God who has an eternal idea of what a human being should be, every time we act, it's as if we're stamping a new coin of this is human nature. This is how humans should behave. And so therefore we're responsible not only for our own actions, but we're also responsible for creating the image of a human that others will follow and future generations will follow. And that gives us this horrible sense of responsibility that fills us with anguish. That's a big part of Sartre's philosophy. On page 134, the last full paragraph, he says, the existentialist, on the contrary, thinks it very distressing that God does not exist because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. There can no longer be an a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Nowhere is it written that the good exists, that we must be honest, that we must not lie, because the fact is we are on a plane where there are only men. Dostoevsky said if God didn't exist, everything would be possible. That is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist, and as a result, man is forlorn, because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. He can't start making excuses for himself. So, interpret the comparisons as you will, but I've given you a few samples from Sartre's reading that you can compare to Nietzsche's idea of not being able to endure or being able to endure the renunciation of belief in God. Okay, so the next reading for part 2 of our book will be Henri Bergson, when he compares his idea of the two ways of knowing, which is analysis and intuition. I talked about this a little bit when we were discussing the Tao Te Ching, so we will get back into that in the next video.